to a controversy in St. George just this year. In February of this year, Dixie State College became Dixie State University, despite significant opposition to the name and calls for alternatives such as St. George University. Proponents of the existing name, which include 83% of people with connections to the school, argued that the name honored and referred to the Mormon pioneer settlers of St. George and had nothing to do with the American South's history of slavery and racism. Figures from Will Bagley to the Southern Utah Anti-Discrimination Coalition, meanwhile, contended that there was a connection in people's minds to the Confederacy and to racist attitudes. One editorial concluded with a succinct thesis statement about naming's power to unify or alienate. A lack of shared meaning and opposed emotional connotations toward Dixie setting conditions for marginalization and division. The history of a place, as traced through its names, reveals multiple voices which speak of nearly infinite perspectives and interpretations. The names and stories that stick to a place depend in large measure on social pressures at play where the stories are told. History becomes more complicated, but also richer and more accurate when we consider not only what happened when, but what was remembered about a place through the years. What got a prominent spot on the mantle and what was swept under the rug. According to the historian Douglas Seafeld, quote, individuals with a particular interpretation of the past influence the construction and negotiation of collective memories, and history is therefore fluid. Traditions and their attendant memories are arranged and rearranged to fulfill the particular needs of particular groups at particular times, often resulting in a process where competing memories exist side by side. Quote. Though there was little outright conflict to the naming and unnaming of Zion Canyon and its features in the early 20th century, we can trace the social contours of the canyon and the groups with a stake in it through its evolving toponyms. Such a study reveals the gap between the official and the vernacular, and naming's power to remember and to forget. The first persistent human presence in Zion Canyon dates from the Archaic period as early as 6000 BC. The earliest cliff dwellings were home to bands of ancient Pueblo and date back to AD 500 to 1300. These remnants came to play a role in preserving the place, as we'll see in a few minutes, but we know nothing about what these people called the canyon. Beginning about the same time, Nubic speakers, particularly Southern Paiutes, inhabited and cultivated the region that included the upper Virgin River Valley. We get two possible names used by the Southern Paiutes for the canyon in the 19th century, both filtered through Euro-American interpreters. Ayurvene, and the one that stuck for a while anyway, Mukuntuweap. The other name applied to the canyon dates back to the 1860s. Springdale, located at the southern entrance to Zion Canyon and offering only a narrow strip of arable land, was the last place along the upper Virgin River that the Mormons settled in 1862. Still further up the canyon, separated by more than a mile of rocky land, was an even smaller strip of land in the vicinity of the present Park Lodge, richly fertile as an ancient lake bed. The first settler in the canyon, Isaac Bahunan, also gave the canyon the name by which it was first known to locals, Zion. According to John Wesley Powell, the Indian inhabitants of the region called the canyon Mukuntuweap, which Powell said the Paiutes told him meant straight canyon. However, the historian Angus Woodbury, who was an ecologist and herpetologist in the University of Utah and also a naturalist in Zion for many years, explained, quote, there has been much dispute as to its derivation and application, end quote, to say the least. Woodbury's Southern Paiute informants variously interpreted the canyon name as Red Country, Red Dirt, Big Canyon, Arrow Quiver, or Mukun's Canyon, or they did not recognize the name at all. Woodbury's contemporary, the self-trained anthropologist William Palmer, speculated that it might be derived from the Indian word yucca or oos, the whole word Mukuntuweap, thus meaning Oos Creek, or since the oos was sometimes used for soap, Soap Creek. Elsewhere in his writings, Palmer was convinced Powell had it right, and that the name Mukuntuweap Strait and Oweap Canyon, thus Strait Canyon. The pseudo-Indian name was codified in 1909 when the Mukuntuweap National Monument was formed, pointedly following Powell's designation over the local name Zion. Subsequently, every journalist who wrote about the new monument felt obliged to explain what the unintelligible moniker meant. The New York Times reported that Tuweap meant farmable land, and that Mukun derived from an old Indian named Muggins who resided there. In 1917, a local paper reported that despite claims that the name meant land of many waters or land of the birds, quote, no Indian could be found who recognized the word Mukuntuweap as of Indian origin or who could understand it. Further reinforcing their own interpretation of things, local Mormons who pioneered the region told Woodbury the name meant the place of the gods, or God's land, and that the Indians believed the Great Spirit resided in the West Temple. As probably became clear to Woodbury, the names we give places often divulge more information about the namers than the named. And it is significant to note that the reason we know the the possible names and meanings assigned to Zion by the Southern Pious is that they were disbelieved by the Euro Americans, as they tried to make sense of this confusing name. Nobody seemed to want to know whether the name was accurate or what else the Indians might call it. They just wanted to know what their own imposed name might be. Related to the confusion over the name are the competing stories explaining how the Southern Piutes interacted with the canyon. Angus Woodbury reported that the Indians would not stay in the canyon at night for fear of supernatural powers. They could be seen scurrying from the canyon before dark, often dropping strips of meat to appease the gods that dwelt there. Numerous reminiscences and oral histories from early Mormon settlers corroborate this story, but others discount such tales as patent falsehoods, arguing that the local Southern Piutes cultivated crops in the canyon. Southern Piute Clifford J. called them nothing more than rumors. William Palmer noted, "These pretty stories seldom fail to interest the Eastern visitor, and incidentally they tend to create certain desired dramatic traditions concerning the park. Guides and others about the park who tell these stories supposedly to be true, but like many other pretty stories, they seem to have no foundation in fact. The Indians tell of long encampments in Zion Canyon, even long enough to raise corn and squash." This is William Palmer at the entrance to the small campus, going up to Mount with Andrew Jensen, the church historian. William Palmer, though without academic credentials and certainly prone to error, had deep personal connections to the Southern Piutes and spent a lifetime documenting their language and culture. He wrote, "In naming the features of the land, why the white man's ruthless disregard of the ancient and time-honored nomenclature of the race that was superseded? In most instances, we find that the new settlers scarcely paused long enough to ask the Indians if the country and its parts were named. Our map carries many names that are wholly void of sense or meaning and bear absolutely no relationship to or connection with the places to which they've been attached." From Palmer, we do get another account of what the Indians called the canyon, Ayubune. He says, "This was the name of the Indian arrow river. Ayubune means like the arrow river. One who has only to go into the narrow canyon with its sheer 2,000-foot walls on either side to see how significant and appropriate the name. The feeling is almost akin to walking into a great sack. The old man who gave me the word illustrated by going through the motions of putting an arrow into a quiver and then drawing it out again, saying, 'Have to come out or it go in.'" The name Zion offers the same proliferation of meanings as does Mukuntuweap, and almost from the moment Buchanan bestowed the name, visitors have interpreted its meaning differently. The connotation that has stuck and that has most recently reiterated in the centennial celebration of the park is that of a sanctuary or refuge. Angus Woodbury interpreted this meaning in terms of Buchanan's experience with the persecution of the early Mormon settlers, or the early Mormon movement. In his view, Buchanan, quote, "maintained that should the saints again be harassed by their enemies, this would become their place of refuge." A 1918 Salt Lake Telegram article interpreted the name as signifying a potential refuge from more imminent threats. It said, "This difficult canyon was chosen as a refuge in the event of an Indian attack. How Box Canyon could serve as a refuge in the attack." Other sources say that the inspiration for the name was not safety and refuge, but the beauty of the canyon. Elijah Buchanan stated in 1930, "My father named the place Zion Canyon and said as he gazed up at the great canyon walls, 'These are the temples of God. One can worship here as well as in any man-made temple.'" The story is told that during a visit by Brigham Young in 1870, the underwhelmed Mormon prophet, irritable either from the bumpy ride of the canyon or from finding that the Buchanans were in open violation of the faith's prescription against tobacco, dismissed the canyon saying, "This is not Zion," and perhaps adding Zion as the pure in heart. And the legend said the settlers dutifully or impudently began to refer to the canyon as not Zion. Outsiders interpreted the name as traditional biblical sense. Clarence Dutton of the Powell Survey, we'll come back to him, relied on the description in 2 Corinthians for his interpretation. No wonder the fierce Mormon zealot who named it was reminded of the great Zion, on which his fervent thoughts were bent, of houses not built with hands, eternal in the heavens. Not all were satisfied with the name. A correspondent to the New York Times wrote in August 1873 of a trip into the canyon. The scenery left him speechless, but he found the name deficient. "The valley vastly excels the famous Yosemite," he wrote. "It is called by the Mormons Little Zion Valley, but as this name has only been a short time applied, it is to be hoped that some other, more consonant with the character of the place, may be adopted." The discovery and promotion of Zion to the wider world was accomplished in the late 1800s and the opening decade of the 1900s. Geologist and Civil War veteran John Wesley Powell captured the nation's imagination in 1869 when he successfully navigated the Colorado River through Grand Canyon. The trip to mark the start of the government-funded Powell survey of the Colorado Plateau. Getting back to blank spots on maps, we see one of the Powell survey and the Wheeler survey. had a lot to do with this in 1870 map. You see a pretty blank swath there with the Escalante area. And in 1872, Powell descended the east fork of the Virgin River through what he named Mukuntuweap Canyon, or Roaring Water Canyon, to its confluence with the North Fork. The canyon carved by the North Fork, Powell called Mukuntuweap, though Powell wrote that the events described in this account occurred in 1870 during his preparations for the second voyage down the Colorado River, which you heard about this morning from the attorney. During his article combines reports of different exploratory trips in the area. The descent of Mukuntuweap Canyon actually occurred in September of 1872, after the second Colorado expedition. Further, although Powell's report included several paragraphs describing Zion Canyon up to the Narrows, it appears he never actually went further north than Springdale. And as described in the Journal of Stephen V. Jones, who accompanied Powell down Mukuntuweap, the party arrived at Schunesburg on the afternoon. Schunesburg at the mouth of Mukuntuweap Canyon, south of Springdale. They arrived there in Schunesburg on the afternoon of September 30th and immediately departed southwest to meet their party at Kanab on October 2nd. Powell's description then of Mukuntuweap was probably based on accounts by other members of the expedition. His description of the exploration proved an important case step in turning Zion Canyon into a world-famous natural wonder, as reports trickled back to the eastern United States of this newfound wonder. The trickle grew to a steady stream as associates of Powell presented their findings to the nation. The landscape painter Thomas Moran was invited by Powell to tour the area. He painted during this trip, he painted got the painting for, that sits in the national, in the U.S. capital of the Grand Canyon, and he also painted this image of the Little Zion Valley. J.K. Hillers took some of the first photographs of the canyon, and it was Moran's traveling companion, journalist James Coburn, who was underwhelmed by the name. Included a description of Zion Canyon that strayed from the dry language of scientific description to use rather forward language in describing God's creations in Zion Canyon and other places on the Colorado Plateau. Accompanying the writer's prose were massive folio-sized atlas and meticulously drawn detailed sketches of the striated rock formations there prepared by William Henry Holmes. Another of Powell's colleagues was Frederick S. Dellenbaugh, who promoted the park twice over in 1904 through paintings exhibited at the World's Fair in St. Louis and through a feature article for Scribner's Monthly focused on Zion called The New Valley Wonders. And this promotion did not go unnoticed. Among other things, Dellenbaugh's article shows that names given to by authoritative figures do not always catch on. He named Cable Mountain the Cliff of the Wire and called what we now know as Angel's Landing, called it the Temple of Aeolus the Cyclopean Organ. In 1908, St. George resident Leo Snow surveyed the land that included the western of Zion Canyon for the Office of the United States Surveyor General. His field notes included his observation that from the precipice, a view can be had of this canyon surpassed only by a similar view of the Grand Canyon of Colorado. In my opinion, this canyon should be set apart by the government as a national park. Acting on the authority recently granted by the Antiquities Act and influenced in large measure by Snow's report, President Taft set aside 15,840 acres of the canyon as Mukuntuweap National Monument the next year, 1909. It has been shown that the Antiquities Act of 1906 was intended primarily to allow the President of the United States to protect Indian archaeological sites from vandalism and degradation without having to wait for Congress to agree. The language of the law states that the President has the right to declare, quote, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management allowed it to be protected. As the environmental historian Robert Wright recounts, sponsors of the Antiquities Act envisioned that, quote, national monuments would be small in area and geographically confined to the American Southwest. Sponsor John Lacey assured that the act would simply be used to preserve Indian remains on the pebbles of the Southwest. In fact, Brenner argues, the Antiquities Act was used by the President and the Department of Interior to start the process of getting national parks designated, and in fact followed this plan many times, including for Grand Teton, Bryce, Olympic, Grand Canyon, and Zion National Park. The language employed to promote the designation of Mukuntuweap National Monument in 1909, as well as later expansions to the monument, supports the idea that such a pathway was anticipated with Zion Canyon. In his letter recommending designation of the national monument, Secretary of the Department of the Interior, Frank Pierce, called out the scientific interest of the canyon, its beauty and grandeur, and inaccurately the fact that it was worthless for any agricultural purposes, since there was already agriculture going on in the canyon. In other words, it included this keyword scientific and it had precisely zero value to anyone else otherwise. The language of the proclamation stated that the monument was being set aside as an extraordinary example of canyon erosion and for being of the greatest scientific interest. Absent is any explicit mention of Indian artifacts, even though there were already many known in the canyon. It is possible that the name Mukuntuweap was chosen to imply an Indian presence and importance. Though no specific archaeological justification was given in the proclamation, the name said it all. What else but Indian artifacts would you find in a canyon name of all things Mukuntuweap? By 1917, several important figures were clamoring for an expansion of Mukuntuweap National Monument, and with it a change in the name. Zion Canyon was a very different place than 8 years earlier. In 1916, Utah Senator Reed Smoot secured $10,000 in federal funds for a road. This is the original map that was published with the proclamation of Mukuntuweap National Monument. You see there's very little place name going on. We've got Potato Hollow on the left, which looks over into the canyon, and Hornville, which feeds into the narrows. So road work in 1917. So a road in the canyon that carried tourists all the way to Raspberry Bend near Weeping Rock, within a mile of the entrance to the Narrows. And Governor William Spry supported the improvement of the approach road to the upper Virgin River valleys from Hurricane area, using mostly convict labor. Whereas the intrepid tourist of 1909 was able to reach the site only by wagon or horseback, making frequent fordings of the Virgin River, automobiles could now reach the canyon. Not readily, but they could make it. Beginning in 1917, there was also a first-class camp and concession operating in the park by W.W. Waite, who operated the same accommodations in Yellowstone. Few tourists came at first, but with the end of World War I and the dissipating of the flu epidemic in 1918, their numbers grew rapidly. William O. Tufts, an engineer for the National Park Service on site in Utah to survey the road construction of the park, or the monument, wrote a recommendation in January 1917 to expand the National Monument to include the Great West Canyon, which is located to the west of Zion Canyon, as a right-of-way for a possible future road on the canyon rim and to give a visual setting for the valley. Again, reassurance was given that the contemplated addition had no value agricultural nor mineral and only very inferior grazing. Tufts further recommended legislation making the monument national park, enumerating its scenic, geologic, and archaeological significance. Noting the presence of Indian cliff dwellings, however, was less a call for preservation than pointing out a tourist curiosity, since he pointed out that most were already, quote, mostly destroyed by bandits. They were at least prominent to viewers and easily accessible, though. The Indian rocks, the rock art and Indian dwellings were no longer touted by the park in order to protect them. Mukuntuweap Canyon, which again is the east fork of the Virgin River, has several examples of cliff dwellings. This is an old photo of one, but that whole part of the national park is now closed to protect those artifacts. There is an Indian granary high above Weeping Rock, which you can still see in the canyon. Unfortunately, the next photo I'm going to show you makes this less cool to see. There was an Eagle Scout project in the 1920s to restore the granary, so not of that ancient or vintage. The engineer's Tufts' recommendation included a laundry list of specific sections of the land survey that he thought should be included in the expanded monument. Tufts was among the first to officially call for, quote, careful consideration of changing the name of the monument to Zion, arguing that it is accepted as the name of the valley throughout all Utah. No one but the government authorities speak of it as the Mukuntuweap National Monument. Two pamphlets published next year illustrate this point, the first by a member of the USGS called Mukuntuweap, the Desert Yosemite, and the other by the Union Pacific, who went with the more usable Zion Canyon in their advertising. Anyone rooting for Mukuntuweap as the name faced an uphill battle, especially when the acting director of the National Park Service, Horace Albright, took sides. In May 1917, Senator Smoot wrote Albright asking if the Wiley Company could advertise their concession to the monument using the name Little Zion National Park. Albright cautioned against it, not because he had a problem with the name, he just did not want them jumping the gun on national park status. Albright instructed them to hold off until the monument was made a national park and noted that Smoot himself was already preparing such a measure for Congress in 1917. One reason for their desire for national park designation is made clear in Albright's letter. National monuments assumed a second-class status to national parks and received little attention, needing less funding in Washington, D.C. Albright lamented the fact that although he'd like to advertise Mukuntuweap extensively, he had only $5,000 to market 21 national monuments to the country. After Albright visited Zion in September of 1917, by his own account, making Zion Canyon National Park became his personal quest. He immediately began declaring in public that he would seek national park status for the moment. One thing Albright, picture of him in Yellowstone having to do with bears. One thing Albright was not enamored of was the name, Mukuntuweap. In his memoirs, he recounts, "I always preferred local names, especially native Indian ones, for natural wonders, but Mukuntuweap was a problem. It was too difficult to pronounce and really tough to spell." He found the name Mukuntuweap much more manageable and gravitated toward its meaning as close to heaven. Albright says he began referring to the place as Little Zion Canyon from then on. In October 1917, Albright corresponded with an outdoor writer preparing an article on Mukuntuweap and advised him to, quote, dwell on the Zion Canyon idea rather than the name Mukuntuweap, as the whole interesting history of the Mormon settlement of southern Utah is closely related to the monument, and life in the Mormon communities 100 miles from the railroad is one of the most interesting features of the Zion Canyon trip. More and more figures jumped on the Zion bandwagon. Wilderness advocate and journalist Robert Sterling Yard helped promote the National Parks Movement in a series of publicity pieces. He weighed in on the issue in a letter to National Park Service Director Stephen Mather. "As I see it, there's only one argument on this question. All of the fascinating history of the region clings to the name Zion. It is my belief that we cannot force the name Mukuntuweap upon the railroads and the people. It will always popularly be Zion. Why not then make a change now, taking advantage of this opportunity?" To no one's great surprise, President Woodrow Wilson issued a proclamation on March 18, 1918, expanding the Mukuntuweap National Monument and changing its name to Zion National Monument. And that was the map that accompanied that proclamation. You can see a lot more of the features. Can't really zoom in, but you see a lot more of the features are being filled in. The reason given for the expansion was that the monument was found to contain, again going back to the original intent of the Antiquities Act, found to contain many features of unusual archaeologic, geologic, and geographic interest unknown at the time the monument was created. And the reason for the name change, it said, the canyon was named Zion Canyon by Mormon settlers years before the name Mukuntuweap was given to this region because it was regarded as a safe refuge in the event of Indian attacks. There's the refuge, meaning of Zion coming in, on neighboring settlements, and the name Zion is still applied to this region to the exclusion of the name Mukuntuweap. The monument was expanded from 25.75 miles to 120. The next year, acting on a bill introduced by Reed's Root, Congress declared Zion a national park on November 19, 1919. As the name the canyon was known by evolved, so did the names of features found there. Albright wrote in his memoirs that the name Zion fit because the other names given by the Mormons, such as Angel's Landing, West Temple, and the Three Patriarchs, had a similar feel. Whether Albright believed in the 1910s that Mormons named these features or whether he was misremembering decades later, either way, he was wrong about the origins of such religious names. The Mormon settlers gave landmarks rather plain, possessive, utilitarian names. Some survive today, like Johnson Mountain, Heaps Canyon, the canyon where the emerald pools form, and Cable Mountain, where Flanagan built his cable works to bring lumber down from the rim. Other names did not survive. Flanagan's Peak, for example, was later superseded by the Watchman. The contrast between Pine Creek Peaks, as named by the Mormons, and the East Temple, you can see where the road is going up to the tunnel of the Great Arch in the background. It's now named East Temple. And the difference between the Mormons' Birch Creek Peaks and the Altar of Sacrifice illustrate the difference between names of everyday use and names given by breathtaking passersby who wanted to imbue the canyon with mystery and romance. Geologic features of the canyon were being named after their likeness for years, of course, and the most prominent example is Steamboat Mountain, now called the West Temple. This form towers over Springdale and is clearly visible for miles and miles in every direction. Early Zion adventurer George Fraser of New Jersey huffed in 1914 that the dignified majesty of the Western Temple was disrespectfully, even if with some degree of verisimilitude, he says, dubbed the steamboat by the locals. Another early writer wrote that, quote, at one point may be seen the figures of a woman, a horse, and a pig forming a distinct group. Another, an eagle perched true to its noble instinct high upon the cliffs. So the idea that the locals are naming it after what it looks like. The religious toponyms found in the canyon were assumed by Albright and many since to be Mormon in origin. In fact, they were the brainchild of a Methodist minister turned lecturer named Frederick Vine Fisher. Fisher was a minister in Ogden and then toured the country as part of the See America First initiative and focused on Utah's wonders. Fisher traveled the country promoting the natural wonders of the United States, and In the summer of 1916, he traveled to Mukuntuweap National Monument to capture spots for use with his lectures. On this trip left a lasting mark on the canyon. As described in the newspaper article, the canyon sublime Fisher and his Mormon companions took turns naming the cliffs and promontories they spied from the valley floor. Some of Fisher's designations never took. For example, there's no longer a court of the poets with a feats named Homer, Milton, and Shakespeare. But many others were codified on maps and in the public consciousness with surprising speed. Pamphlets published the very next year used Fisher's best-known toponym, the Great White Throne. The Great White Throne was also known for many years as El Gobernador in homage to Governor Spry for his work with the roads. But the name Great White Throne won out. Again, the picturesque name. Even though few of the canyon's names were particularly Mormon, the Mormon history of the place came to supersede the Indian prehistory in the minds of promoters. The exotic history of the natives still had a role in publicizing Zion Canyon, but the Mormon history was more than adequate to fill the colorful canyon with stories of mystery and intrigue. It is as though the American Indian presence was no longer needed to ice the cake of mysteries. Many of the stories told the Mormons to promote the canyon had a moment of turning when the narrator said, in effect, surprise, these Mormons down here are actually kind of normal. They're extremely pleasant and accommodating, and boy do they grow mean watermelon. Story after story, or an article after article about going to Zion says you have to stop and eat the peaches in Tokerville, the watermelons of the Virgin are the best in the country, that sort of thing. Also told in stories are suggestive stories of polygamist mansions on the hill. This is the Mill Mansion in Schunesburg at the mouth of Primitive Canyon, which it is said had 2 doors, one for each wife. And this was the sort of thing that got incorporated into a visit to Zion, was this cultural curiosity. Horace Albright paints a picture of the Mormons as being cooperative and promoting the canyon. He says, I shall always remember with keenest delight my early association with these good Mormon people who, without knowing what a national park was, cooperated so fully in executing orders that brought them real hardship. Again, his memory and his memoirs are a little fuzzy because the 1910s are full of letters back and forth that he wrote as people tried to get around the grazing ordinances and such in the canyon. But at any rate, the curiosity of interacting with Mormons became a key part of the Zion Canyon tourism experience. A tongue-in-cheek article about toponymy appeared in the New York Times in 1925. The title refers to the name, the type of people, just two cuters. The title of the piece is called Just Two Cuters Now Invade Zion National Park. And the title refers to the type of people who, according to the article, stand on the north rim of the Grand Canyon of Arizona and declare it's just too cute for words. The article celebrates such worthy and witty names as Angel's Landing and Court of Patriarchs, names, it says, that match the bold and impressive rocks. Names which have become legends, the article declares, should be protected no less than spots they adorn. The irony, of course, is that most of the names cited approvingly from Zion Canyon were of relatively recent vintage. The article reports the formation of a committee to give official names to the features of the park. Such a committee was likely related to the Board of Geographic Names, which gave features the names found in official USGS topographical maps, and which set the Zion Canyon names in stone in the 1920s and 1930s. The article concludes that new cute names would make the quote, postcard tourist feel better about it, and after all, the old-timer will cling to the old, homely, friendly names that Providence provided. This statement gets at the relationship between naming, memory, and history. Naming is a social process, one that certainly privileges some voices while excluding others, but especially in the case of Zion Canyon, one that often works around top-down or distant attempts to impose structure and meaning. Just as Zion persisted in the name enforced, even though a presidential proclamation would have it otherwise. The keeping of local names, we could have gone on to discuss Kola or Fat Man's Misery or various other names in the park. The keeping of these local designations means that the stories and meanings wrapped up with the names persist. Even anglicized, bowdlerized names like Mount Kennesawa or Temple of Sinawala preserve some semblance of the southern pipe history of the canyon and opens the opportunities for the inquisitive tourist to learn something of the native folklore of Zion Canyon. At the same time that naming represents an erasure of history and the projection of self in the external world, it also signifies a willingness to enter a relationship with the canyon and with any location. To name a place is to consider it worth